Every neighbor on that ridge thought she'd lost her mind, hauling mud buckets up the hill all through October. Two men on a fence rail watched her and said nothing worth repeating. She didn't look up. She never did. I rode in on the second day of November with $14 in my pocket. I rode into that settlement on November 2nd with $14 in my pocket and no plan worth the name. 43 days on the road from a played-out cattle job outside Sheridan, Wyoming, where the foreman had looked at me like I was a fence post that had rotted through. "We don't need you past October," he'd said, not even bothering to look up from his ledger. "Move along, Mercer. Plenty of nothing out there for men like you." Men like me. I let that sit in my chest for 6 weeks of riding, and it still tasted like dust. The rumor was thin. Someone on a ridge north of the settlement needed a hand before winter locked the valley down. That was all I had. A rumor, a tired horse, and a hatchet on my belt that had been with me longer than any person. I saw her before I knew who she was. From the trail above the river, I could see the cabin set back against the ridge, double log walls, which was unusual for a place that size. And below it, moving between the river and the hill, a woman hauling mud buckets. She had a system. Down to the bank, fill the bucket with river mud, pack in dried bunch grass by the handful, haul it back up the slope. Press it into the gaps between the logs with her bare hands, then back down again. I stopped my horse and watched, not because I meant to, because I couldn't figure out why nobody was helping her. She made 9 trips that afternoon. I counted every one. Her boots were caked with river clay so thick they looked like they'd been dipped in concrete. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a low knot at the nape of her neck, loose strands stuck to her face with sweat and mud. She never stopped, never sat down, never looked around to see if anyone was watching. Her name was Marin Hollis. I didn't know that yet. The general store sat at the bottom of the valley where 2 wagon roads crossed. I tied up and went in for coffee because I was out, and a man without coffee in November is a man who's given up on himself. Frank Lundgren was there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his brass pocket watch chain catching the lamplight. Stocky, silver-haired, pale blue eyes set in a face that had opinions about everything. 2 other ranchers flanked him like they were waiting for permission to laugh. Frank gave me the once-over. My faded tan coat, my scuffed boots, the hatchet on my belt, and decided I was worth exactly nothing. "You see the widow up on the hill?" he said to the others, not to me. "She's been at it 3 weeks. Whole place looks like a beaver dam." Laughter. The kind that comes easy when you're warm and dry and someone else is doing the suffering. "Woman doesn't know when to quit," one of the ranchers said. "Henry built that cabin in 2 weeks flat. Now she's trying to rebuild it 1 mud bucket at a time." "Henry built a lot of things fast," Frank said. He tilted his head, that skeptical look he wore like a coat. "Fast and wrong." More laughter. I bought my coffee and said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, because the words I had weren't the kind you say in a store where you're nobody and you've got $14 to your name. Frank noticed my silence. Men like Frank always notice silence. It bothers them. They take it as a judgment they didn't ask for. "You looking for work?" he said, finally addressing me directly. "Maybe." "Well, there's nothing here." He said it the way you'd tell a stray dog to move along. Flat, final, like the conversation was charity he was already regretting. I paid for my coffee and walked out. Eleanor Cahill was on the store porch. I didn't know her name yet either, but she was hard to miss. Petite, white-haired, straight-backed as a fence rail, with small, round, wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the gray November light. She had a leather-bound journal in her apron pocket, and she stood with her hands clasped in front of her like she'd been waiting for something specific, and I happened to be it. She was watching me. More precisely, she was watching me watch the hill. From the porch, you could see Marin's cabin, small against the ridge. You could see the dark line of the trail she'd worn between the river and the wall. You could see her moving along it, bucket in hand, steady as a clock. Eleanor said one line. She said it without looking at me, her hazel green eyes fixed on that hill behind those brass-framed spectacles. Her husband built that cabin with single walls. She's fixing what he left undone. Then she walked away, slow and precise, like every step cost something, and she intended to spend it exactly right. I stood on that porch for a long time. The wind came down off the ridge, smelling like sage and cold creek water, and the faint mineral bite of river clay. My horse shifted behind me. $14. No ties, no plan, no reason in the world to ride up that hill. I rode up that hill. Marin was pressing mud and grass into a gap between the logs when I came up the trail. Her hands were raw. The brass ring on her right hand, her late husband's wedding band, caught the last of the afternoon light. She didn't turn around, though she must have heard the horse. A woman alone on a ridge hears everything. She just chose not to look. I dismounted, pushed my hat back from my forehead. My dark brown hair was too long, past my ears, and the wind moved it across my face. "I can work through the winter," I said. "Room and board, no wages." She kept pressing mud into the gap, methodical, thorough. Her shoulders were squared, her chin level. A woman who does not look down. "I didn't ask for help," she said. I tied my horse to the post, stood there with my hands at my sides, watching her work. The hatchet on my belt pressed against my hip. The wind smelled like sage and coming snow. I wasn't sure why I didn't ride on. He didn't ride on. That's the part I still can't explain to myself, even now. Something about the way she packed that mud, steady, mechanical, like she'd done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more whether anyone showed up or not, made leaving feel like the wrong answer. So I stayed. That first night, I slept in her barn without permission. Didn't knock on the cabin door, didn't announce myself. Just walked my horse into an empty stall, pulled the saddle off, and unrolled my bedroll on a stretch of hard-packed dirt between a cracked feed trough and a stack of old fence rails. The barn smelled like hay gone half to dust, and mouse droppings, and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. I had $14 in my pocket, 43 days on the road behind me, and no plan beyond morning. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind come down off the mountains, and thought about what kind of woman doesn't tell a stranger to leave and doesn't ask him to stay. Morning came, cold, gray light through the gaps in the barn siding. I sat up and found her already outside. Marin stood at the fence rail, not looking at the barn, not looking away from it either. She set down a tin plate, 2 biscuits, a strip of dried elk, and a cup of black coffee still sending up steam, right on the top rail. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin without a word. Didn't glance over her shoulder. The door shut behind her. I understood what that was. Not permission, not refusal. A test. I ate the biscuits, drank the coffee, washed the plate in the creek and set it back on the rail where she'd left it. Then I found her axe leaning against the north wall of the cabin and started splitting firewood. She had maybe 2 days' worth stacked. For a woman heading into a Montana autumn, that was nothing. The rounds were cottonwood mostly, soft, stringy, hell to split clean, with a few lengths of lodgepole pine mixed in. I worked through the morning without stopping, The leather-handled hatchet on my belt wasn't built for it, so I used her full-size axe and let the rhythm carry me. Split, stack, split, stack. By noon, I had 4 cords against the north wall, packed tight, bark side out to shed rain. She watched from the cabin window. I know because I saw the curtain move twice. But she didn't come out, didn't say a word. After the wood, I found a gate hinge on the horse corral that had rusted clean through. The gate hung crooked, dragging in the mud, leaving a gap wide enough for a calf to slip through. I pulled the old hinge, shaped a new pin from a nail I found in the barn, and rehung the gate so it swung true. She still said nothing. I was starting to understand that silence was her language, and I'd better learn to speak it. The next morning, the coffee was on the rail again, and beside it, a bucket of river clay. That's how I learned the mud packing method, not through conversation, through doing. She came out after I'd been staring at the bucket for 10 minutes and walked straight to the south wall where the gaps between the logs were worst. She knelt down and started mixing. 2 parts river clay to 1 part dried bunch grass, torn into short lengths and worked in with both hands. Creek water added slow until the mixture held its shape when you squeezed it. She packed it into the gaps with the heels of her palms, pressing hard, smoothing the surface flat. I watched her do 1 section, then I moved to the opposite side of the same wall and started. We worked like that for hours. Hands in the same cold mud, 3 feet of log wall between us. Her dark auburn hair pulled back in that low knot, loose strands stuck to her temples with sweat. The plain brass ring on her right hand, her late husband's wedding band, catching dull light every time she pressed another handful into a gap. She didn't correct me, didn't praise me. Once, when my mix was too wet, she glanced at it and then glanced at hers. That was the instruction. On the 4th day, Frank Lundgren rode past. I heard him before I saw him, heavy hooves on the packed trail, the creak of a saddle that cost more than everything I owned. He sat his horse on the ridge above the property, barrel-chested and silver-haired, that brass pocket watch chain catching the sun like he wanted you to notice it. Pale blue eyes taking inventory of everything below him like it was already his. He looked at me, looked at Marin, looked back at me. "Widow's got herself a new hired man," he said. Not to me, not really to her, to the air, to the idea that we were something to comment on. The contempt in it was casual, the kind of contempt that comes from a man who's never had to pack mud into someone else's walls, who's never worked a day without knowing exactly what he'd be paid at the end of it. I set down my bucket, straightened up, pushed the brim of my dusty brown hat back with 1 knuckle, and looked at Frank Lundgren until he had nothing left to say. He shifted in his saddle. The watch chain swung. He rode on. Marin didn't look up from her work, but her hands slowed for a moment. Just a moment. Eleanor came by on the 7th day, Marin's mother-in-law, petite, white-haired, straight-backed as a fence post, those small wire-rimmed spectacles with brass frames perched on her thin nose. She carried her leather-bound journal in her apron pocket the way some women carry a Bible. She sat on the porch and watched us work for an hour without speaking. Just watched. Her hazel-green eyes moving between us like she was reading a sentence neither of us had finished writing. Later, I wasn't supposed to hear this, but sound carries in thin mountain air, she said to Marin in the doorway of the cabin, "He didn't ask what you'd pay him. That's either foolish or something else." Marin didn't answer. The door closed. By the end of the 2nd week, we'd packed 40 linear feet of wall. She still hadn't said my name. Not Caleb, not Mr., not you. But she left the barn door unlatched every night, and the coffee appeared every morning. The first real cold came on November 19th, Not the killing cold, but the warning. 22 degrees at dawn. I know because I checked the thermometer nailed to the post outside the barn. Glass fogged, mercury sitting low like it had given up. The creek had a skin of ice along both edges, thin enough to see through, thick enough to matter. I took the hatchet from my belt loop and cracked it in 3 places so I could fill the buckets. The leather handle was so cold, it burned my palm through the callus. Up at the cabin, smoke was already curling from the stovepipe. Marin had the fire going before first light. And here's the thing. The walls held. All that mud, all that grass, all those buckets hauled uphill and packed into gaps with bare hands, it held the heat from the stove overnight. The cabin was warm when she woke, warm enough that the water in the pitcher by her basin hadn't frozen. She noticed. I could tell because she stood in the doorway that morning and looked at the walls, really looked at them, the way you look at something that just proved itself. She ran her hand along the seam where the old timber met the new mud pack. Then she pulled her dark brown wool shawl tighter across her shoulders, squared up, and walked to the barn without a word. That was enough. Now. Down the ridge about 4 miles, Frank Lundgren's ranch house was doing what Frank Lundgren's ranch house always did when winter showed its teeth. It leaked. Cold came through every gap in the frame, every warped board, every window that hadn't been properly seated since the day it was hung. His wife stuffed rags into the frames. Rags. Like that was going to hold back a Montana winter. Frank complained about it at the store in town, stood there by the counter with his arms crossed, that brass pocket watch chain catching the light, his pale blue eyes squinting at nothing in particular while he told anyone who'd listen that the early cold was going to be hell on everyone's stock. Someone, I heard later it was the clerk, mentioned Marin's mud walls. Said he'd heard she had a man packing them with river clay and grass like the old Norwegian homesteaders used to do. Frank scoffed. Actually scoffed. Shifted his weight to one leg, tilted his head that skeptical way he always did, and said, "Mud walls. That woman's playing house with some drifter who'll be gone by Christmas. You watch. She'll be begging for help by January like she does every year." She'll be begging for help. That's what he said. About a woman who hadn't begged for a single damn thing from anyone in 3 years of running that ranch alone. A woman who split her own wood and dug her own post holes and buried her own husband in ground she broke herself. Frank Lundgren didn't know the first thing about Marin Hollis. He just knew she was smaller than him and alone, and that was enough for him to decide she was less. Meanwhile, Marin and I were finishing the last section, the north wall, the one that faced straight into the canyon wind, the one that took every gust like a fist. We worked 36 hours across 2 days. I'm not rounding. 36 hours. We mixed mud in the cold, river clay and dead grass and water hauled up from the creek in buckets that froze on the outside before I got them to the mixing spot. We pressed it into the gaps with numb fingers, working by lantern light when the sun dropped, working by feel when the lantern blew out. 18 days of labor. 200 buckets of river mud carried uphill. $0 earned. I hadn't asked for pay. She hadn't offered it. That arithmetic made sense to both of us in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone else. Somewhere in the middle of the second day, late afternoon, the light going orange and flat against the mountains, we reached for the same gap in the wall. Her hand went in from the left, mine from the right. Our fingers met inside the cold mud. Neither of us pulled away, not for a beat too long. Her hand was rough and strong, a working woman's hand, the plain brass ring on her right finger pressing against my knuckle. My hand was cracked and red from the cold. We stayed like that, fingers touching in the dark, wet clay, and I could feel her pulse through the mud. Or maybe that was mine. I don't know. Then we both pulled away, at the same time, like we'd agreed on it without speaking. We didn't look at each other. She smoothed her section, I smoothed mine. The wall got finished. Eleanor Cahill arrived the next morning with a jar of preserved plums. She came up the hill, slow and precise in her black lace-up ankle boots, her white hair pinned up neat with that tortoiseshell comb, her small leather-bound journal tucked into her apron pocket the way it always was. She sat on the porch, didn't ask to come inside, didn't offer to help, just sat there with her hazel green eyes sharp behind those small, round, wire-rimmed spectacles and watched us finish the north wall. Marin tamped the last section. I stepped back. The wall was done, solid, thick, dark with river clay, the grass fibers showing through like stitching in a quilt. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, "Mud and grass. That's how the old ones did it in Norway." Her grandmother would have known. She set the plums on the porch rail and walked back down the hill without another word. That evening I was in the barn, sitting on the overturned bucket I used as a chair, cleaning mud out of the hatchet head with a rag, listening to the wind test the north wall and find nothing to grab onto. The stove in the cabin was going. I could smell wood smoke and something else. Broth, maybe. Something warm. Then I heard her voice from the cabin door. "Caleb, there's soup." First time she'd used my name. Not you or hey or nothing at all. Caleb. She said it plain, the way you'd say a word you'd been carrying in your mouth for a while and finally decided to let go of. That night, Caleb sits in the barn and hears her say his name for the first time, calling from the cabin door. "Caleb, there's soup." He sits still for a moment before he stands. Something has shifted, and he knows it. December came in quiet, the way the worst months always do. No wind, no warning, just the sky turning the color of a tin plate and staying that way. The soup was venison and root vegetable, thin but hot. Caleb ate it standing near the stove because there were only 2 chairs and he hadn't fixed the third one yet. Marin sat at the table with her bowl and didn't tell him to sit, didn't tell him to stand. Just let him be where he was. That was enough. By the first week of December, they had a rhythm, not a plan, a rhythm. The kind that forms between 2 people doing the same labor in the same space without needing to talk about it. Mornings started before light. Caleb fed the 2 horses and the milk cow while Marin checked the root cellar. They had flour, they had salt pork, they had dried beans in canvas sacks, and a few jars of preserves Eleanor had brought over in October. Enough to last until March if they were careful. If nothing went wrong. And something always goes wrong on 50 acres of open range in a Montana winter. But you don't say that out loud. You just count what you have and keep your mouth shut. She had a way of moving through chores that told him everything he needed to know about how long she'd been doing them alone. No wasted steps, no hesitation. She'd haul water from the creek before the ice got thick enough to need the axe, and she'd do it without asking him to come along. He came along anyway, carried the second bucket. She glanced at him once, then looked forward. That was the whole conversation. One evening, maybe the 5th or 6th of the month, they sat together mending harness by lantern light. The leather was old and cracked in 3 places, and the buckle on the breastplate had bent during the mud-packing work. Marin held the strap taut across her knee. Caleb pushed the awl through. Their hands moved together the way hands do when 2 people have been working side by side long enough that instruction becomes unnecessary. She shifted the leather a 1/4 inch before he needed her to. He pulled the thread through before she had to ask. The lantern threw their shadows long against the cabin wall, two shapes leaning toward the same point. He noticed the brass ring on her right hand, plain, unpolished, too large for her finger. A man's ring. Her late husband's. Caleb looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, then looked back at the awl. He didn't ask about it. Some things you don't ask about. You just see them and understand what they mean and keep working. Frank Lundgren showed up on the 9th, rode in on that stocky sorrel of his, silver gray hair cropped close under a hat that had seen better decades. He needed hay. His stores were short. Said it plain. No excuses, no apology. Just stood there with his arms crossed and his pale blue eyes flat as creek stones. Marin gave him 2 bales without hesitation. Didn't negotiate. Didn't ask what he'd give in return, just pointed to the stack near the barn and said, "Take what you need, Frank." He loaded the hay onto a makeshift travois behind his horse, walked through the barn while he was at it, ran one broad hand along the mud-packed wall Caleb had built, pressed his thumb into it. Didn't say thank you, didn't mock, just looked at the wall, looked at Caleb, and loaded his hay and rode off. Caleb watched him go, and he understood something about Marin that he hadn't put words to yet. She gave without keeping score. Not because she was soft. Hell, she was harder than half the men he'd worked for. But because keeping score meant you expected something back, and expecting something back meant you needed people, and needing people was the one thing she would never admit to. That evening, Eleanor came by. The old woman moved slow and precise through the cabin door, her white hair pinned up neat with that tortoiseshell comb, wire-rimmed spectacles catching the firelight. She brought a jar of blackberry preserves and a look on her face that said she had something to say and would say it in her own time. She waited until Marin went out to check the cow. Then she sat across from Caleb at the table, folded her thin hands in front of her, and told him. Thomas Hollis, Marin's husband, died 2 winters back. A fall from a horse on frozen ground, the kind of accident that happens so fast there's no story to tell. Just a man riding, and then a man on the ground, and then a woman alone on 50 acres with a life that didn't stop needing tending just because the person she'd built it with was gone. Marin ran the ranch alone for 2 full years. Every fence, every feed run, every frozen morning and every broke-down piece of equipment, and every night where the wind came through the walls and there was no one on the other side of the bed. Eleanor looked at Caleb over those brass-framed spectacles. "She didn't cry where anyone could see," she said. "That doesn't mean she didn't cry." Then she picked up her jar and her shawl and walked out into the dark like she'd said exactly what she came to say and not one word more. A few nights later, the 12th maybe, Caleb sat at the table repairing a chair leg, the 3rd chair, the broken one. He'd found a piece of pine in the barn that was close enough to the right shape, and he was whittling it down with his worn leather-handled hatchet, then smoothing it with a rasp. Marin sat across from him, darning a wool sock. The stove ticked. The lantern hummed. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch. 5 minutes. 10, maybe more. The cabin was warm, the light was low, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the space between them didn't feel like work. It felt like home. Not the word, the thing itself, the actual weight of it. 2 people in a room who didn't need to fill the silence because the silence was already full. Caleb finished the chair leg, set it in place, tested it with his hand. It held. On December 14th, the temperature dropped to 11 below zero. Caleb woke in the barn and couldn't feel his hands. That was the night everything proved itself. or didn't. 11 below zero. The kind of cold that kills cattle standing up and turns creek water to stone in an hour. I rolled off the cot in the barn and my fingers wouldn't close, couldn't make a fist, couldn't grip the edge of the blanket. I breathed into my hands and the air that came out of my lungs was barely warmer than what surrounded them. The water bucket beside the stall door had frozen solid. Not a skin of ice on top, not a crust. Solid. A block. I'd filled it 4 hours ago. The wind came from the north, steady, not gusting, not howling, just a constant pressure against the barn walls, like a hand leaning on a door it intended to open. The gaps between the wallboards glowed pale where moonlight and cold pushed through together. I could see my breath in thick white clouds that didn't dissipate. They hung in the air like something waiting. The horses knew. Juniper stamped and blew, her nostrils flaring wide. The milk cow stood rigid in her stall, legs locked, head low. Animals don't panic in cold like this. They go still. They conserve. They wait to see if they'll survive it. I didn't wait. I pulled on every layer I had, the dark gray wool shirt, the faded tan canvas coat, a horse blanket wrapped over my shoulders, and I started working. The hay bales stacked along the east wall became insulation. I dragged them one by one and banked them against the north-facing wall where the wind hit hardest, stacking them too high, pressing them tight against the gaps until the pale lines of moonlight disappeared. My hands burned. My fingers split at the knuckles where the skin had dried and cracked from weeks of labor, and the cold got into those cracks like it had been invited. Marin's husband had installed an iron stove in the corner of the barn years ago. Small thing, maybe 18 inches across, with a crooked pipe that vented through a tin collar in the roof. I'd cleaned it out in November, but never lit it. Now I fed it kindling and struck a match and watched the flame catch and held my hands over it until the burning in my fingers shifted from cold burn to heat burn, and I couldn't tell the difference between the two. Horse blankets went over the gaps in the south wall. I nailed them up with fence staples, stretching the heavy wool across the boards, sealing what I could. The barn wasn't built for this. No barn on this ridge was built for this. But the stove threw heat into that small space, and the hay bales blocked the wind, and by midnight, the thermometer I'd hung on the center post read 4 degrees. 4 degrees inside. That was enough. The animals would hold at 4. Across the ridge, Frank Lundgren's place was failing. I didn't know it then, I learned it after, but his cattle had bunched against the south fence line the way cattle do in a killing wind, pressing together, pushing against the wire until the posts bowed. 2 of his hands rode out at 10 o'clock to push them toward the tree-line shelter, and one of those men came back with frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand that turned black by morning. Frank's house, that big house he was so proud of, leaked heat through every window frame and door seam. The man who'd told Marin her mud walls were a waste of time sat in his kitchen in his dark brown wool coat, with his wife wrapped in blankets beside the stove, watching his breath cloud in his own home. His brass pocket watch ticked in his coat pocket, counting minutes he couldn't buy his way out of. The Petersons lost a horse that night. Just found it standing dead at the fence line at dawn, legs locked, frost on its eyelashes. The Caldwell family burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 nights and sent their eldest to the Petersons' place to borrow more. Word moved along the ridge, slow as frostbite itself. Who was holding, who was breaking. The cold didn't care about pride, didn't care about acreage or money or how loud a man talked at the feed store. It asked one question: did you prepare? And it answered itself. Marin's cabin held. The river mud and bunch grass packed between those double walls did exactly what her grandmother's method promised. The stove burned steady on a careful feed of split pine and dried sage bundles, and the walls didn't leak. Not a draft, not a whisper. She checked the thermometer nailed to the porch post at 3 in the morning, 16 below, the cold still dropping, and stepped back inside to 58 degrees. 58. Warm enough to sit without a coat. Warm enough to sleep under one blanket. The cabin that Frank Lundgren had called primitive, that he'd looked at with that skeptical tilt of his head and his arms crossed like a man watching something beneath his consideration, that cabin was the warmest structure on the ridge. 58 degrees inside while the world outside tried to kill everything that breathed. I fed the barn stove every 90 minutes through the night, checked the horses, checked the cow, broke the new ice forming on the water bucket with the heel of my leather-handled hatchet, and refilled it from the barrel I'd moved inside 2 weeks ago because Marin told me to. She'd said, "Water freezes. Put the barrel in the barn before December." I hadn't asked why. I'd just done it. And now I understood that every piece of preparation she'd insisted on, the hay bales, the stove cleaning, the barrel, the banked walls, had been aimed at this night. She'd known it was coming. Not the date, not the degree, but the certainty of it. The frontier didn't forgive the unprepared. She'd learned that from the land, and the land had learned it from time itself. By morning, the barn thermometer read 16 below. The cow was alive, the horses were alive. Caleb walked to the cabin and Marin opened the door before he knocked. The cabin was warm. The walls held. The freeze held for 9 days. 9 days of 16 to 20 below. 9 days that separated the prepared from the proud. I'm going to tell you what those 9 days looked like, because they mattered. They mattered more than any single thing that happened on that ridge before or since. The first morning set the pattern. Caleb came inside from checking the animals, his dark brown hair stiff with frost where it curled past his ears, ice crystals in the stubble on his angular jaw. Marin had coffee on the stove and 2 plates on the table. Not 1 plate on the table and 1 set aside for him to carry to the barn. 2 plates, side by side. He sat down without being asked. She sat down without explaining. They ate salt pork and biscuits, and neither of them said a word about the arrangement. That was the first morning. Every morning after was the same. Here's how the rhythm worked. Marin cooked. She kept the cabin. She mended what needed mending, and she watched the sky through the window she'd sealed with oilcloth and pine pitch back in October. Caleb kept the stove fed. Every 4 hours, day and night, he pulled on his faded tan canvas coat and went out to check the animals. He broke ice in the water troughs with the worn leather-handled hatchet he carried on his left hip. He checked hooves. He checked breathing. He moved hay. He came back in with his gray-green eyes watering from the cold and sat by the stove until his hands worked again. They did not talk much. They did not need to. 2 people locked into a survival rhythm don't waste words. You move, you work, you eat, you sleep in shifts. You get up and do it again. The cabin stayed warm, 18 below outside, 62 degrees inside. Those mud and straw walls that half the ridge had laughed about were holding steady like a stone church in January. And that's when the word started to spread. Day 3 of the freeze, Tom Peterson showed up at Marin's door. His wife, Sarah, was with him. Their cabin, good timber, tight joints, respectable by any standard, was 34 degrees inside. They'd burned through half their winter wood in 3 days trying to keep the temperature livable. Tom's face was red, not from the cold, from what it cost him to knock on that door. Marin let them in without a question, didn't ask how long they needed, didn't ask what happened to their own preparations, just opened the door and stepped aside. Day 5, the Caldwells came. Ben Caldwell and his wife Ruth and Ben's brother James. Their place was worse. 28 degrees inside and dropping. James had frostbite starting on 3 fingers of his left hand. Marin put him by the stove. She wrapped his hand in warm cloths she'd heated over the iron grate. Caleb made coffee. He made a lot of coffee those days. Pot after pot, standing at the stove with his sleeves pushed up past his forearms, pouring tin cups for people who 3 months ago wouldn't have taken a drink of water from Marin Hollis if they were dying of thirst. 7 adults in that small cabin. 7. And nobody, not one damn soul, laughed about the mud walls. You know what they did instead? They touched them. They put their hands flat against that ridiculous patchwork of river clay and straw and felt the warmth radiating back. Tom Peterson stood there with his palm on the wall for a full minute without speaking. His wife looked at Marin with an expression I'd describe as something between shame and wonder. Marin said nothing about it. She poured coffee. She made room. That was Marin Hollis. She didn't need you to apologize. She just needed you to stop being in the way. The worst night was day 7, 20 below, wind off the ridge like a blade. Eleanor Cahill arrived at the door wrapped in her heavy black knitted shawl, her white hair pinned up tight under a wool cap, those small, round, wire-rimmed spectacles fogged from the cold. She was 68 years old, and she'd walked a quarter mile through 20 below because she knew where the warm cabin was. Same as everyone else. She didn't need warming. Her own place was fine. Eleanor had insulated her root cellar years ago, and she'd spent winters harder than this one. She came because she wanted to see. She sat by the stove. She opened that small leather-bound journal she carried in her apron pocket. She wrote something. Caleb was across the room pouring coffee for Ben Caldwell's brother, the hatchet still on his belt because he'd just come in from checking the horses, his dark brown hair damp with snowmelt, his gray-green eyes quiet and focused on the cup he was filling. Eleanor watched him. She watched him move through that crowded cabin like he'd been there his whole life, filling cups, checking the stove, stepping around people without bumping them. A man with $14 in his pocket and no claim to anything, serving coffee to strangers in a cabin that wasn't his. She leaned toward Marin. Marin was standing by the window, her dark auburn hair pulled back in its low knot, loose strands framing her face, the plain brass ring on her right hand catching the stove light. "He said yes before you finished the sentence," Eleanor said. Marin looked at her sharply. Her dark brown eyes went narrow and hard for exactly 1 second. Eleanor closed the journal. She didn't say another word about it. She didn't need to. That line landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went all the way to the bottom. Day 9, the last day of the deep freeze. The temperature had held at 17 below since midnight. Frank Lundgren came up the ridge road. He came alone. He came slow. His silver-gray hair was bare to the wind because his hat was in his hands. That broad, blunt face was set in an expression I'd never seen on Frank Lundgren before. Not anger. Not skepticism. Not that sideways tilt of judgment he wore like a second coat. Humility. He stood on Marin's porch with his dark brown wool coat buttoned to the collar, his brass pocket watch chain glinting dull against the fabric, and he asked her to show him how she'd done the walls. She said yes before he finished the sentence. No gloating, no satisfaction, no told you so, just yes. Frank Lundgren stood on Marin's porch with his hat in his hands and asked her to show him how she'd done the walls. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Caleb watched from the barn door and understood something he couldn't yet say. The freeze broke on December 23rd. 28 degrees felt like spring, and that's when the real question started. Not whether the walls would hold, but whether I would. I'd been running from things my whole adult life, 17 years of it. Every ranch, every bunkhouse, every town with a saloon and a general store and a woman who smiled at me twice. I'd find a reason. The work dried up. The foreman was a bastard. The land didn't suit me. Always a reason. Always clean enough to believe if I didn't look too hard. The ridge exhaled that morning. I could hear the ice cracking in the creek, slow pops like distant gunfire, and the pines dropped their loads of snow in soft thuds that shook the branches bare. Marin's walls held. Every damn one of them. The mud and straw mix had set hard as stone under the freeze, and now that the temperature climbed, they weren't cracking. They were curing. The work was done. Winter was survivable, and there was no reason for me to stay. Christmas came 2 days later, spare and quiet, the way everything was on that land. No tree, no ribbons. Marin cooked a hen she'd been saving, roasted it with dried sage and the last of the wild onions she'd braided and hung in the root cellar back in October. We ate at her table. Eleanor Cahill sat at the head, her white hair pinned up neat with that tortoiseshell comb, her hazel-green eyes watching us both through those small, brass-framed spectacles like she was reading a book only she could see. After supper, Marin set a pair of wool socks on the table in front of me. Gray wool, tight-knit, even stitches. She'd made them during the freeze, working by lamplight after I'd gone to the barn. I picked them up and turned them over in my hands. They were warm from sitting near the stove. I reached into my coat, that faded tan canvas I'd been wearing since Billings, and set a small wooden box on the table. I'd carved it from a piece of barn oak during the long nights, sanded it smooth with a flat river stone. The lid fit snug. I'd cut a shallow groove inside, lined with a scrap of soft leather, sized to hold a brass ring. She looked at it, looked at me. Her dark brown eyes steady and direct, the way they always were, but something moved behind them. She picked it up and turned it in her capable hands, and her thumb found the groove inside, and she understood. "For when you wash dishes," I said. She set it down carefully. "Thank you, Caleb." Eleanor wrote something in that little leather-bound journal of hers and said nothing at all. January came in, hard and gray. Frank Lundgren showed up on the 4th with a proposition. His north wall needed packing. The old mud had crumbled in the freeze, and he wanted it done the way Marin had done hers. 3 days of work. He asked me straight, standing in the yard with his brass pocket watch chain catching the flat winter light, his pale blue eyes level under that heavy brow. 3 days we hauled mud from the frozen river, breaking through ice with the flat of an axe to get to the clay beneath. My hands went numb inside the first hour and stayed that way. Frank worked beside me without complaint, his stocky frame bent over the riverbank, his silver-gray hair dark with sweat despite the cold. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. We mixed the clay with straw and packed it into his walls, layer by layer, the way Marin had shown him. On the second day, he handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You're not as useless as I figured." Coming from Frank Lundgren, that was damn near a love letter. On the third day, when the last wall was packed and drying, he reached into his dark brown wool coat and pulled out $15, counted it into my hand. 3 5s, crisp and folded. "Fair wage," he said. "Don't spend it stupid." The $15 sat in my pocket alongside my original 14. $29. I counted it twice that night in the barn, sitting on my bedroll with the leather-handled hatchet laid across my knee. $29. Enough to ride south. Enough to buy a week in a boarding house in Denver, find work on a cattle drive heading to Texas, start over somewhere warm where nobody knew my name and nobody expected me to be there in the morning. I folded the bills and put them back in my pocket. A week later, clear night. Stars sharp as nails driven into black wood. Marin and I sat on the porch after the animals were settled. Our breath came out in white clouds that rose and tangled together before the cold took them. She had her dark brown wool shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, loose strands of auburn hair catching the lamplight from the window behind us. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Nowhere in particular." "That's not a place." I didn't answer. I looked at the stars and felt the $29 in my pocket like a stone. She didn't press. That was the thing about Marin. She never pressed. She just left the silence there and let it do its work. And the silence did more damage than any argument could have. The fear crystallized that night. Lying in the barn, staring at the rafters, listening to the mare shift in her stall, I understood it clearly for the first time. I wasn't afraid of the work. I wasn't afraid of the cold or the land or the animals. I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd become someone who could be hurt by leaving. I'd become someone with a place to lose, a table to sit at, a pair of wool socks knitted by hands that knew exactly how big my feet were. Every place I'd ever left, I'd walked away clean. No marks, no debts, no one standing in a doorway watching me go. I got up before dawn. The sky was still black. I pulled my saddle off the rail and set it on the mare's back, cinched it quiet. My hands knew the work. They'd done it 100 times in 100 barns. I moved the way I always moved when I was leaving, deliberate, unhurried, like a man who'd already made his decision and just hadn't told anyone yet. She found him in the barn, saddling his horse at dawn. She stood in the doorway and didn't say a word. She just stood there. And that was worse than any argument she could have made. She stood in that barn door for what felt like an hour, probably 30 seconds. She didn't ask me to stay. That's what broke me. See, if she'd asked, I could have said no. If she'd cried, I could have told myself she was being unfair. If she'd grabbed my arm or blocked the door or said something sharp and desperate, I could have pulled away the way I'd pulled away from every place and every person for the last 15 years. That's how leaving works. Somebody gives you a reason to feel justified, and you take it like a gift, and you ride out before the sun clears the ridge. But Marin didn't do any of that. She just stood there, dark auburn hair pulled back in that low knot at the nape of her neck, loose strands catching the early light. Canvas apron still on from the night before, dried mud along the hem. Her hands at her sides, not fists, not reaching, just hands. And those dark brown eyes looking at me the way a woman looks at weather she can't control. Steady, level, already accepting what hasn't happened yet. That's what got me. She wasn't surprised. She'd been waiting for this since the day I showed up. Every morning she probably woke and checked the barn to see if the horse was gone. Every evening she probably listened for the sound of hooves on the road. And now here it was. The thing she'd known was coming, and she would not give me the satisfaction of hearing her say, "Don't go." Because she'd said it before. To a husband who went anyway, to a world that took and never once asked permission. Marin Hollis had learned the same lesson I had, just from the other side of it. I learned that leaving was freedom. She learned that asking someone to stay was handing them a knife. So she didn't ask. And I stood there with one hand on the saddle cinch and the other on the horse's neck. and I counted my reasons to leave the way a man counts coins. I had $14 in my pocket. I had a body that still worked. I had 43 days of road dust, washed off but not forgotten. I had the whole territory out there. Wyoming, Colorado, anywhere the wind pushed. I had the clean simplicity of being no one's problem and no one's promise. I counted those reasons like gospel. Then I counted my reasons to stay. I found one. She was standing in the doorway. My father left when I was young enough that I don't remember his face, but old enough that I remember the sound of his boots on the porch. That's a hell of a thing to carry. Not a face, just a sound. Boots, walking away. He was a drifter, seasonal hand, the kind of man who called freedom what the rest of the world calls cowardice. My mother never said a bad word about him, which was worse than if she had, because it meant she still loved him. And loving a man who leaves is a wound that doesn't close. He taught me one thing. Not with words, he wasn't around long enough for words. He taught me with his absence. The lesson was simple. If you never stay, you never lose. If you never build, nothing burns. If you never love, no one gets to stand in a barn doorway at dawn and break your heart without saying a single damn word. I carried that lesson for 34 years, through ranch jobs and trail work and cow towns and line camps, through winters alone and summers spent earning just enough to survive the next winter alone. I carried it like it was mine, like I'd chosen it. But I hadn't chosen it. He chose it for me. A man I can't even picture decided what kind of life I'd live, and I let him, because it was easier than deciding for myself. I looked at Marin. She looked back. The brass ring on her right hand, her late husband's wedding band, caught a sliver of morning light. And I set it down. That lesson? I set it down the way you set down a rock you've been holding so long your hand forgot it was clenched. There wasn't a sound. There wasn't a moment of revelation. I just let go. The decision was not dramatic. That's the part nobody tells you. The biggest choices of your life don't come with thunder. They come with quiet hands and a horse that needs unsaddling. I loosened the cinch, pulled the saddle off. The leather creaked the way it always did, and the horse shifted his weight and blew out a long breath like he'd been holding it too. I set the saddle on the rail. I took the bridle off, hung the tack on the nail by the door, the same nail I'd driven in myself 6 weeks ago when the old one rusted through. Then I walked past her, close enough that my shoulder almost touched hers, close enough to smell sage and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the soap she made from tallow and lavender. She didn't move. I didn't stop. But in that space between us, that inch, maybe 2, something passed that I still can't name. Permission, maybe. Or surrender. Or just 2 people who were done pretending they didn't need this. I walked into the cabin. I sat down at the table. I put my hands flat on the wood, rough-hewn pine, scarred from years of knives and plates and the daily weight of living. And I looked at the grain, and I said it. I'm not good at this. She came in behind me. I heard her boots on the floor. She didn't sit. She stood across the table with her hands on the back of the chair, and her dark brown eyes found mine, and she said, "Neither am I." And that was enough. Not a declaration, not a promise, just 2 people telling the truth for the first time. We were both terrified. We were both bad at this. And we were both still here. 4 days later, Eleanor came by. Petite and straight-backed, white hair pinned up with that tortoiseshell comb, wire-rimmed spectacles catching the afternoon light. She found us mending the east fence line together. Marin held the post while I drove it. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Eleanor watched from the gate for a long while, her hands clasped in front of her the way they always were. Then she pulled that small leather-bound journal from her apron pocket, opened it, and wrote something with a pencil stub. She read it aloud to no one, maybe to the wind, maybe to herself, maybe to the mountains. He stayed. 2 words. The whole story. I unsaddled the horse. I hung the tack on the nail. I walked past her into the cabin and sat down at the table and put my hands flat on the wood and said, "I'm not good at this." She said, "Neither am I." And that was enough. Spring came slow that year, the way it does after a winter that tests you, like the land wasn't sure it trusted the warmth yet either. But the creek broke open in March. First a trickle under the ice shelf, then a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for months. Water ran clear over the stones again, and the mud along the banks softened, and the whole valley seemed to shift its weight from one foot to the other. We moved cattle to spring pasture on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Marin said, "Tuesdays are for things that need doing," and I didn't argue. We rode the 50 acres together that morning, side by side, checking fence line and counting heads. 43 cattle had made it through the winter. We'd lost 2 to the cold. The rest stood blinking in the pale light like they couldn't believe it either. She didn't call me her hired hand anymore, didn't call me much of anything. But when we split at the tree line to flank the herd toward the upper pasture, she looked back once before she rode north. And there was something in that look that had nothing to do with cattle. The mud walls had dried through the winter, set hard as kiln brick. I ran my hand along the surface one morning and felt the texture of it. Grass fibers locked into the earth, solid and rough and warm where the sun hit. They'd held. Every damn inch of them had held. Frank Lundgren came by in April, brought his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth I'd seen once at the general store in town. Frank stood in the yard with his arms crossed, that brass pocket watch chain catching the light against his dark wool coat, his pale blue eyes scanning the cabin walls like he was looking for a crack he could point to. Ruth walked up to the south wall and put her palm flat against it, held it there a long time. "It's warm to the touch," she said. Frank nodded, shifted his weight, looked at the ground, then at the ridge, then at nothing. "She was right," he said. That was it. No speech, no handshake, no, "I'm sorry I called your idea worthless and told half the valley you'd be buried under your own walls by February." Just those 3 words. She was right. It was the closest Frank Lundgren ever came to an apology. And I'll tell you something. It was enough. Marin didn't need more than that. She never had. The foal came at 3 in the morning on a night in late April when the air smelled like wet sage and new grass. I heard the mare before Marin did. A low sound, not quite a groan, something deeper. I lit the lantern and pulled on my boots and was halfway to the barn before the cabin door opened behind me. We worked in the yellow circle of that lantern light for 2 hours, my hands on the mare's flank, steadying her, talking low and steady the way my father taught me when I was young enough to listen. Marin's hands guiding the foal when it came, slick and dark and impossibly fragile. Her fingers sure, her voice calm. The mare trusted her. I trusted her. When that foal stood on shaking legs for the first time, all knees and ribs and enormous wet eyes, Marin made a sound I'd never heard from her. Not a cry, not a laugh. Something between the two, something that lived in a place she didn't let people see. She put her forehead against my chest, right there in the straw and the lantern light, with the mare breathing hard behind us and the foal wobbling like the whole world was new. I didn't move. She didn't move. My hand came up and rested on the back of her head, on the dark auburn hair that had come loose from its knot, and I held it there, and the lantern flickered, and neither of us said a word. There was nothing to say. There was everything to say. We said none of it and all of it at once. Eleanor saw the spring from her porch across the ridge. She told me later she'd been watching since March, the two figures moving across the pasture, the smoke from the chimney that started earlier and lasted longer, the second horse that never left the rail. She closed her leather-bound journal for the last time that April, set it on the shelf beside her bed. I know because Marin told me years later, and Marin doesn't make things up. "Your grandmother would have liked him," Eleanor said one afternoon, her hazel-green eyes sharp behind those small brass-framed spectacles, her white hair pinned up neat as always with that tortoiseshell comb. Marin looked at her. "She would have made him work harder." Eleanor laughed. It was the only time I ever heard that sound from her, small and dry and real, like a creek stone turned over to show the bright side. That summer, I built a second room onto the cabin. Proper walls this time, double-logged, packed tight with mud and grass from the start. I felled the timber from the north slope and dragged it down with the mare, cut the joints with the worn leather-handled hatchet I'd carried through every mile of my life that mattered. I didn't ask if I could. She didn't tell me to stop. The room was understood the way the creek is understood, the way the season is understood. Some things don't need words. They just need someone to show up with an axe and start building. That was 28 years ago. The cabin has 6 rooms now. The mud walls, the original ones, the ones Frank said would crumble, the ones she mixed with her own hands in November, they're still standing. I patched them twice, she patched them once. The rest of the time, they just held because they were built by a woman who knew what she was doing. Grandchildren play in the yard where Marin once hauled buckets alone. They don't know what it cost. They don't need to. That's the whole point. I sit on the porch in the evening light, my hair gone silver, my hands slower than they used to be. Marin sits beside me, her dark auburn faded to something softer, the brass ring still on her right hand. Her hand finds mine the way the creek finds the stones, without thinking, without trying, because that's the direction everything flows. 28 years later, I'm still not good at this. Neither is she. The walls are still standing. So are we.